Lord Jesus, thank you for your word. Thank you for your truth.
Yes.
Inspire our hearts. Amen. Now the survey, the umbrella flyby that we did for Revelation last week was hardly comprehensive. Right? So we could go into a whole lot more breakdown of even chapters and divisions, and we'll probably do that I'm going to add that into what we're doing. But I want to start the lesson this morning with the four main perspectives on how people read the Revelation, okay? And once I show you these, it's going to make sense to you why, depending on what churches you've been involved in, why they read it the way that they did, and why what we're talking about over the course of our study is probably something that you haven't heard about, all right? So the first one, and I'll start with the one that pretty much everybody is very familiar with in American evangelicalism, and it's called futurism. And so basically the futurist reads the Revelation this way. Chapters 1 through 3 are about the past. Chapters 4, well, it depends on where you are in time. But the bulk of it, right? So chapters 2 and 3 are to the 7 churches. But the events described in chapters 4, come up here and I will show you what must take place after these, all the way until the end of the book is the future. So everything is the future. And the guys that advocate this typically say that what happens in chapter 4 with John, come up here and I will show you the things that must take place after these, or this. This is the 7 churches, and the future is everything in the book of Revelation, and John's caught up into heaven there is what they believe to be a type of rapture. Okay, that's how they read it, all right? So if you turn on WAVA and you listen to any of the Baptist guys on the radio, this is how most of them are reading it. This is what's really popular. And this has been what's popular amongst Pentecostals since, really since the beginning of the Pentecostal. That's not exactly accurate. When the Pentecostal denominations start forming in the late teens, the teens and the 20s of the 1900s, they go this way because of fundamentalism. What was first? Remember, liberalism or fundamentalism? What was first? Liberalism. Liberalism was first. So, because the liberalism came out of the mainline denominations, and they said, what did they say? They say they were the ones that broke away from Rome because Rome believed in the authority of the church. The Pope wasn't infallible till the late 1800s, okay? And the Roman Catholic doctrine of infallibility for the Pope was a response to liberalism. So why did they say the Pope could be infallible? To guard against the Protestant liberalism that was developing in Germany and other parts of Europe. So then when the Pentecostal movement comes along, and the people are getting filled with the Spirit and speaking in tongues and doing miracles, all this stuff, they're looking at the text and they're saying, wait a second. The text says that we're experiencing it. It's clearly, there's authority here. We can't be liberal. We're not going to be Roman Catholic because that's the Antichrist, because they were still interpreting it like some of the Reformers were. So because some of the Reformers interpret Revelation 13 and the great harlot as a reference to the Roman Catholic Church. That's how they were reading it, right? Well, if you're not going to be liberal, you're not going to be Roman Catholic, what's left? That's when fundamentalism starts in the early 1900s. And it's a response to liberalism.
So what is fundamentalism saying?
Fundamentalism is, they basically boiled down, it's nominalism. They reduced as much as they thought they could to what is required to be a Christian. And they had 5 points, and most of those 5 points were built around Jesus. And it has to go with the way that you interpret Scripture, but it's not, let me put it this way, it's not consistent.
Okay.
So you would see a lot of fundamentalist churches and holiness churches kind of going hand in hand for a while. And so for an example, it would be like this. In some holiness churches, men have to wear ties. In some holiness churches, men don't wear ties. They can wear jewelry, or they can't wear jewelry, or it gets very.
Yeah, into these.
And it's how you interpret the Scripture. It's how you read it. And so when I bring up the fundamentalism and the futurism, they would read this. It goes like this: you take it as literally as you can, as often as possible. In the future. It's the future. All right.
What do you call liberalism from the church's perspective?
the Jesus of myth versus the Jesus of history. Or that the Bible isn't infallible.
Okay.
It's a collection of writings that reflects a worldview. Like what we're dealing with in our larger culture right now is because of theological liberalism. We can the text doesn't apply to us.
Mhm.
It doesn't have to apply.
Then
Be-
it's not an anchor though. As soon as it's flexible, it's like, oh, just.
Yeah, and that
whatever
goes
makes
back.
you feel
That goes
good.
back into some of the philosophical developments of the 1700s, and because philosophy and theology are bickering sisters. And so when one rises, the other takes the back seat, and then it does this through history.
Mhm.
And it's the rarity when they come together.
Right.
And usually what happens is when they come together, something pretty ingenious is created, but you can't always prove it because the philosophical component isn't based on revelation.
Right.
You see that with the scholastics in the 12 and 1300s. That's one of the references. If a unicorn has one horn, how many horns does two unicorns have? Right. Well, how do we even know they're unicorns? Well, that's not the point. If there is a unicorn and a unicorn has one horn, so you take the philosophy, the if this then that
Right.
argumentation,
Right.
and the irony with that is we do it all the time.
Right.
The problem is when you make a dogma, and that's a different thing, and that's not about revelation. Okay, second one is what we're going to call historicist. So the revelation is ongoing through history, and it's fulfilled through history. So for example, 1,270 days is a reference to 1,270 years. And so Jonathan Edwards actually advocated some of this. And he talks about 1,270 days, and I believe it's from the collapse of the Roman Empire to the fall of the Papal States is 1,270 years. And so he says, so this is an example of historical fulfillment. This really isn't popular anymore. But it was popular for a couple hundred years. That should tell us something right there. Movements can be really popular for a few hundred years and dominate the way people look. Now here's the thing about it. Even though it kind of falls to the wayside, it doesn't go away because it still affects the people that came after it. There's a reason another idea developed after it. There was something in it, all right?
Could you just give another brief description of this historicist?
Yeah.
The example didn't
Yeah, I have to agree.
mean
What,
much to me.
a little more boiled down. Instead of-
The historicists would say that the Whore of Babylon is the Roman Catholic Church. And so when you watch the collapse of the Roman Empire, like the secular Roman Empire, what takes its place? The papacy. And so then the Pope rules as a priest king, essentially, as a bishop king, from then until the Papal States are collapse in the 1800s.
So they parallel history with
Yes.
scripture.
With the Revelation. Yeah.
With the
Yeah.
revelation.
That
And
we are,
insert it. Sorry. That was it, really.
Yeah.
we've lived through that part of the revelation.
Yeah, the problem is we're going further in history, so you're going to have to reinterpret. You got it. Like the further you move the dial down the timeline, the more you got to go back and reinterpret things in the past. Okay. Third one is an idealist. This is not more popular, but this has been pretty consistent through church history. And so it says that the visions and the images and the pictures and all of the stuff in the Revelation don't have a specific fulfillment. They have multiple fulfillments. Because the Revelation are visions that are reflecting spiritual truths that are true at any moment in history. So the idealist, because I mentioned the Whore of Babylon with the historicist, the idealist would say, well, no, that's always been around, because what is that but the false church of the spirit of Antichrist? And when is the spirit of Antichrist, when did that show up? Well, John writes about it in 1 John. So the spirit of Antichrist has always been around. So the idealist would look at that and say, this is always the case. This is a spiritual These are visions reflecting spiritual realities that are always at work. Okay? And so they would read like, so when John talks about, and then I saw, or then this was opened and this happened, all of that, none of that's chronology for them. It's just reflective of spiritual truths that are always at work. And then the fourth other major one is what's called preterism. And this basically says it's all fulfilled, except for the last couple chapters. In all of these groups, you've got shades of folks. So you've got what are considered partial preterists, a guy like R.C. Sproul or N.T. Wright. And then you got full preterism, which is pert near unorthodox. Because
challenge pert near, but
because
they
some
say
of the
the
guys,
resurrection's already happened.
right? Because it depends on what the particular teacher is. This is one of the challenges in our multi-denominational world that we live in. And so when, like as we've been praying and we get together with other churches and the different churches that everybody comes from, right? And you'll hear this all the time. Doctrine and theology don't matter. We just need unity. You've just made a theological statement.
Excuse me.
Because what are you going to unite around?
Great.
What is the basis of that unity? Well, Jesus is. Okay, well that is another theological statement. So what about Jesus is the unity? Well, he's the Son of God. That's really, really important. But what else is he? Like, what layers of theology can we dismiss and say those really are secondary and what's primary, right? That's not easy.
Right.
That's not easy. Because if we go with the Pentecostal charismatic line, well, I feel it. I know it inside. I have the assurance from the Spirit. That's when I go reference the Mormons. So do they. And they have corresponding signs and wonders. And they've got a better missionary program than any other denomination in the United States right now. So when I say pert near, it's because some of the preterists, Paul flat out talks about Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom he handed over to the devil because they taught that the resurrection had already happened. Well, you can't really hand people over to the devil if they just go down to the church down the street.
Right.
So preterism is it's already happened.
Yeah,
Everything.
specifically, it was all fulfilled in 70 AD with the fall of Jerusalem. So most preterists, whatever shade they're in, would say that the Revelation is written somewhere between 67 and 69 AD, and it pertains to the fall of the city. And there's a lot of merit in this. Right? Futurists, if you're coming out of futurism, you dismiss this pretty quickly. And that's dangerous. Because all you got to do is go back and read Matthew 23, Luke 21, and Mark 13, and guess what you're going to read in each one of those synoptic gospels? It's all about the fall of Jerusalem. All of it. And so then when you come back and you reread the Revelation and you put yourself in that historical context, a lot of stuff starts making a lot of sense really, really fast. I mean, Jesus is so specific in the synoptics that liberal scholars say that's why it was written afterward. Because it's too precise. The Revelation, it's too precise. Because if it's true, then there's real prophecy.
They did the same thing to Daniel. They said
Yeah.
Daniel was written in like 150.
Yeah, same thing. So these are the four major divisions of reading the text of the Revelation. Questions? Other questions? What time is it?
So what is the founding fathers
10:15.
written about and like the Holy Spirit revealed to you and how you understand Revelation?
The fathers, we've got Irenaeus, Justin Martyr in around 150, and then Irenaeus in about 180. They wrote comments on Revelation, but it wasn't like on the whole book. And then you've got, in about 200 AD, Hippolytus, who's in Rome. He writes one of the first comprehensive commentaries on it, but it's lost. So we've only got bits and pieces of it. The first entire commentary that we have on the Revelation is written by a guy named Victorinus. I think I'm saying that correctly. And that's right around 300 AD, 303. He's martyred in 303 by Diocletian. I've got quotes from him for the sermon because his is the first full commentary. And it's basically a blend. It's like, so if you were to go back and you were like try to figure out which one he was, he's not one of them.
Yeah.
So he talks about the fall of the city. Like, they know about the historical events. But then there are certain spiritual truths that are always the case. And then there is a future element, because Jesus hasn't returned physically and transformed in the world, and resurrection hasn't happened yet. So it's a lot of it. It's an ongoing thing. This is why I brought up these 4 things. This second lesson was to say, when you go and you read the text, one of the things that you want to do is don't try to figure out what it's referring to, whether it's the future or the past. Don't do that. Not at first. What you want to do first is just figure out what in the world is happening in the story. What's the narrative describing? For example, I'll give you an example. The 6th seal, or the first seal of the 7 seals, what is it? So let's be reading the Revelation. The first seal is a white horse, right? So the futurist says this is the Antichrist. This is the spirit of Antichrist. And they will go back and parallel to Matthew 23, because you can see a parallel in Matthew 23 with the 6 seals. And that's, whether it's intentional or not, you can see kind of some of the same ideas. It's the Antichrist. And say, well, why is it the Antichrist? Well, because he goes out to conquer and he doesn't have a bow, so he's being diplomatic. Yeah, it's a futurism. That's why it's the Antichrist. But go back and read other commentators, modern and ancient. It's not the Antichrist, it's the preaching of the gospel. What? Yeah, they read it as the preaching of the gospel. Because the gospel doesn't conquer with weapons. And the rider's white. And there's no place in the Revelation where white is negative. It's always positive. And so think about how 2 very different readings you get then. So either the Antichrist is the one who will use diplomacy to create a situation that really his intent is to bring war, and then war brings death, or war brings famine, and famine brings death, and then there's martyrs, because the whole world's risen up against the church, because of the Antichrist. That's one reading. Well, the other reading is this. No, the gospel goes out in power. And Jesus said, I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. And so when the gospel goes out and is preached, the response is the world rises in its rebellion more intensely, and the church rises in its devotion, and the result of that is war. And the war brings about judgment, and the judgment brings about death. And of those who die, guess what? A lot of them are martyrs, which is the very next seal, which goes right into chapter 7. All of these martyrs. So it's very important that we understand the literary flow of the text, what's happening in the story. And are we going to just say that the colors and the shapes and the forms, that we can just arbitrarily make them what we want, or are we going to be consistent with it? And those are important questions.
So I always thought it was Jesus in the Word, because the double-edged sword coming out of his mouth, right?
But there's no sword coming out of the mouth of the rider. So it is the Lord's word in 1 and in 19.
Okay.
And you have, and that's a good segue to the next thing I want to do this morning, unless there's other questions.
Yeah, it's interesting, because the first seal, it's like he goes out to conquering and to conquer.
Yeah.
And you're right, you look at it different, and all of a sudden it's,
Right. Okay, so now let's jump into contrasting images. So the Revelation is full of contrasting images, right? So you mentioned one, and this one isn't a contrast, it's more of a comparison. Jesus in chapter 1, parallel Jesus in chapter 19. Right? So we're going to need to kind of move it on a little faster. So let me do this. If you guys would do, one of you go to chapter 1, one of you go to chapter 19 and pair up, all right? Charlie, if you and Jesse could pair up for Revelation 11 versus Revelation 13, okay? The 3 of you guys, since you're right there together. Go for Revelation 12 and Revelation 17. And
which one do you want, 12 or 17? Where you at? Okay. You got 17?
and I don't know that I've got enough time to give this one to look at. Why don't you guys, you want to do 1 through 19, and you want to do 11 through 13, and then 12 through 17, and then we'll just
Which one?
1 through 19, 1 and 19. So just take like the next 30 seconds and
Is that chapter?
Yes.
Chapter?
Yeah. All right. I know that wasn't a long time. But this is enough of the process to be figuring out kind of what's happening in the whole book is laid out with these contrasts, okay, and comparisons. So chapter 1 and chapter 19 are two different visions of Jesus. In chapter 1, he's a high priest. In chapter 19, he's a warrior. And so you want to compare them. So anything that you guys noticed in 1 or 19, or up here, anybody who looked at that? I'll bring out one so we can just keep moving. One of them is the sword. So in both images, both visions, he has a sword that comes out of his mouth. The sword that comes out of his mouth in chapter 1 raises John up. So John has fallen down as a dead man. But when the word that's spoken by Jesus, the sword, comes to John, he says, don't be afraid. And so he's calling John, he's saying, get up, basically. Saying, don't be afraid, and calling him up to hear and to speak and to receive the revelation. In chapter 19, he's coming down on the white horse. And the sword's coming out of his mouth. And he's not saying, don't be afraid. This is when he kills the armies that have come against him. All of them. So the same sword is bringing life and it's bringing death. And the sword is the word. The sword is the preaching of the gospel. Contrasting images, okay? 11 and 13. Chapter 11 is the two witnesses. Chapter 13 is the two beasts.
The death and resurrection of the witnesses and the supposed death and resurrection of the beast. I saw that.
Yeah, there's parallels. Yeah. And so they're not random parallels, right? So John is contrasting them on purpose. He's comparing them like he's trying to show something in it. So the two witnesses die and are raised because the breath of God comes back into them, right? And the world is angry, but the beast comes back alive and the world worships it. So he's contrasting the church, the gospel, the two witnesses, with the two beasts and their satanic empowerment and how those things mimic what's right. They mimic what's good. Right? So he's comparing them. So this is why you got to be really careful that you don't just read it chronologically and say, well, then this is going to happen, and then that's going to happen, and this is... You're missing the point. You don't see how they interlock together. Okay? Next one is 12 and 17. Chapter 12 is the bride, and chapter 17 is the harlot, the whore of Babylon. Contrasting the two women. And so the woman in chapter 12, who does she give birth to? The child. It's Christ. In chapter 17, the harlot, what is she? She's not giving birth to it, but where is she? She's on top of the beast. She's riding the beast like he's a horse. Yeah. Contrasting the images. One is pure and heavenly and righteous and good. The other is wicked and depraved and has a golden chalice filled with the blood of the saints because she's drunk on the blood of the apostles and the prophets and the martyrs. Contrasted to the woman who's protected by God who flees in the desert because, and we can keep going with the parallels here, the harlot has a golden cup. It's a perversion of the Eucharist because the 7 angels have 7 golden bowls. It's the same word. And they're pouring out the wrath of God upon the woman and the beast. Contrasting images. Questions? Let that sink in for a second. Because once you see this, it's like liturgy. Once you see it, you're never going to unsee this again. You're going to go back to the text and you're going to say, whoa. And it's all set in the context of worship, by the way. Big portion of it. I mean, John's on an island, but it's the Lord's day. He's in the Spirit. He's called up into heaven. And what does he see? Worship. And then what does he measure? The temple. And what was everybody dressed up as? Priests? I mean, how much time do we have?
4 minutes.
4 minutes. That's plenty of time. So now that's what I wanted to cover this morning. So if you have a specific question from something that you've read in Revelation or you've heard taught in the past, now's the time to ask it.
Too many of those. This
Yeah,
is
just
opening
pick
up
one.
a world of-
Right.
Well, you know what I've been taught when I was a teenager, the one about the Roman Catholic Church being the harlot.
Yeah.
And so, is there anything that specific in Revelation that actually would actually legitimize an idea like that?
No.
Okay, there you go.
As an identity for the harlot. I mean, is there a way to, how are we identifying the harlot?
Yeah, how did they get to the Roman Catholic Church being the harlot?
Well, they were the enemy at the time in the
That's how they did it.
Reformation, but
Yeah, that's
also there's the evidence of the 7 hills that's
Right,
seated
yeah.
upon the 7 hills.
Right.
Yeah, which surrounds.
7
Rome
hills
is-
of Rome.
Set based on 7 hills. So they say, well, this is evidence. So is Jerusalem. If we go with these 4 readings. The historicist and the preterist are I won't say it, the preterist is going to tell you that the harlot is Jerusalem in Judaism. Because go back into the world of the New Testament. Who's killing the Christians? Who's inciting Rome to kill the Christians? Who's chasing Paul from city to city to get him killed? Right. Right. And so what is the eschaton? What is the end of the age? The end of the age and the end of the world aren't the same thing. The end of the age is the collapse of the religious system that Jesus denounced when he cleansed the temple. So the very words that you see in the Gospels where he goes in and he throws out the money changers, and some, I think, is it Matthew or Mark? One of the Gospel writers uses the word brigand in the Greek. And it's the same word that Josephus will use when he describes the people that hold up in the temple to fight the Romans. When Jesus says that when you see Jerusalem surrounded with armies, and then he mentions the fig tree, in the springtime, its time is near. Vespasian's army is coming in the spring of 67. I mean, it's that precise when he's predicting the fall of the city. And he bases his messiahship on his prediction of the destruction of the temple. And the temple's destroyed, the city's destroyed, everything is wiped out. So this is the fulfillment. And so what we've got is Peter in Rome preaching and teaching this to the Roman Christians while Mark is taking notes. That's where his gospel comes from. We've got Matthew's account, we've got Luke's account, it's all the same thing. I think John's much later. I think John's so late that when he talks about destroying the temple and rebuilding it, everybody knows he's not talking about that physical temple anymore because it never comes back. It never comes back. The difficulty with futurism is when you start jumping into what about today? How do you interpret the events in the last few years? Even though it was a futuristic empire that established, there's a whole lot of layers to that. I don't have time for that. But for the Antichrist being the Roman Catholic Church, that's what they're saying. And so this goes back to what I mentioned, like where do you draw the line? When do you stop saying that someone's doctrine has gone too far or it's not enough? That's what's happening. And so as much as you have the Inquisition in medieval Europe with Roman Catholics, some portions of the Roman Catholic Church torturing and killing heretics, Protestants doing the same thing. They're doing the same thing. Calvin burns a guy at the stake. Lutherans are drowning Anabaptists. Church of England's burning people who don't agree with them. It's all over the place. That's an example of taking the text out of its history and applying it to your own day in a way that you shouldn't do it.
That's
Okay.
As he sees the stunned looks on our faces.
It's really important, and this is in a certain way, this is how this ties into the stuff we're doing on Wednesday nights with prophecy. Because people are like, well, God told me. Yeah, but you got to parse that out.
Mhm.
What do you mean he told you?
Right.
I believe God speaks to us, right? I think everybody who knows me knows that. But we got to be careful. Because go back and ask the reformers who said the Roman Catholic Church was Antichrist. God told them. They knew it. It could be that you're just inciting rebellion against the state because it is corrupt. Those are two different things. Who was the guy that was leading armies with Luther? Not with Luther. And Luther like you got to stop that. And I knocked that off. And the guy was claiming to have visions and was prophesying.
You got me?
I think he was one of the guys that was part of. Was he part of the Peasants' Revolt?
Yeah, I think so.
And he claimed inspiration of the Spirit. All you got to do is go back in history and look at charismatic renewals and how bad they turn out, which is one of the things that's pretty good about what we're living in right now. It's not quite the same, at least as far as I can tell.
Sorry, what do you, because we're not as violent?
Yeah.
Yet. Yet, we're not as well yet.
Yeah, well, we're slowly getting there, you know.
Yeah, we're getting, somebody's getting though.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe it gets
In
more,
other
I mean, kill 'em
countries.
now.
Yeah.
It's violent.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.